Hello, everyone. I'm Pinar Givanch, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of chatting with Marzia Mortati. Marzia is an associate professor at the Department of Design at Politecnico di Milano. Her research interests focus on service design and public sector innovation, with a particular emphasis on the intersection of design, data, and innovation, as well as design for policy and the role of artificial intelligence in public services. Since 2007, she has taught these topics to international and multicultural groups and has published academic papers in leading journals since 2008. She has also participated in numerous international research projects, collaborating with both researchers and practitioners worldwide. Nowadays, her curiosity about the future of design research and practice continues to drive her academic journey, keeping her passion for the field alive. Enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with Marzia Mortati. She's an associate professor at Department of Design at Politecnico Milano. Marzia, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I have enormous amount of questions for you, but before we dive into all of that, I did a very quick introduction about yourself, but please tell us more, your background and things you're working on these days.
Of course. So, as you already mentioned, my main job title, my main occupation is to be an associate professor at the Department of Design here at Politecnico in Milan. As part of this job, there is one main research interest that concerns my activities that is linked to designing services and designing these services, especially to serve the public sector and therefore pursue public sector innovation, which has led me lately to becoming much more interested in new technologies and especially artificial intelligence and data. To study how these new technologies are affecting the design process and the innovation that design brings with itself. Therefore, as part of these, I teach these topics linked to service innovation, and also I teach designers how to adopt a human-centric approach for developing AI-powered systems. In general, I also try to have an outlook for how the design process and the tools and approaches that design uses for innovation are evolving according to these new technologies that are shaping our life.
Thank you, and very exciting. And it's great to always hear educators in the space, like addressing this field, as we do feel like the land is shifting. We are going through, I feel like, our generation's industrial revolution at the moment. And what does that mean in design and for designers? It's something that occupies my brain very often. And also, I had the chance to be at South by Southwest last week, just sitting on all sorts of AI panels. And as much as there's hype around like AI possibilities, opportunities, and technologies that are happening, I found there was less conversations on the shift that we're seeing. I mean, there were conversations, but more on in terms of like what would jobs look like and what should employment look like, and maybe like responsibility and ethics around, technology development in general. But I feel like it is a grander shift that is happening, and these conversations are being discussed in silos, and which is not a coincidence because our systems are designed and organizations are designed that way, right? In the end, everything that we're experiencing is some sort of a design and creation. So I would love to hear your take on kind of like the landscape that we are in today, and where design, also the practice of design and the design outcomes we observe, and kind of like how you see that evolving over time.
Yeah, so I think that this is a super interesting and ambitious question at the same time. It is very complex to reply in a whole encompassing way, also because because we are in this very moment of great shift, very massive shift due to these new technologies and the way these technologies influence our lives, it is hard to find some points that do not shift at the same time. So I think design is certainly one of the disciplines and practices that is evolving the most according to these latest changes that we are witnessing, because design was essentially born as something that is extremely concerned with everything that is man-made. One of the most used definitions of design was given by Herbert Simon at the end of the 60s. And he said that design is to transform courses of actions toward preferred situations. So what does this mean for us? It means that design really deals with everything that people have built. Everything concerns our behaviors, our structures, our objects, and the services in which these objects are embedded are an object of design, whether of study, so from a research perspective, or of practice from a more professional perspective. So that's why it's very interesting and also very difficult to pin down what are these evolutions, because on the one hand, design has very strong legacies linked to this idea of the first industrial revolution and how the meaning of objects, the objects of design was meant back then, and how it needs to evolve nowadays to accommodate all these shifts and these quickly evolving realities and behaviors that we have. For instance, I think that there is one very core and important shift that design as a process is consistently going through, and not many have still understood how to grapple with this shift. That is the idea of moving from producing perfect outputs, which has been for very long the main objective of design, whether design was designing graphic artifacts, communication, objects, services, interactions, and so on, to moving to outputs that are just, so to speak, good enough for now, because they are going to be living things by themselves. And this is, I think, one of the most important shifts that design is going through nowadays, and one of the most important skills that we need to teach to our future professionals in design schools and in general.
I love this so much. And also it resonates so much as we often talk about, refer to systems theory and talk about the fact that we operate in a complex system, and what does that even mean, given the all volatility and uncertainty introduced, like events like the pandemic or war, or also in our case, like discussion here, AI. And it's such a good thing to highlight for designers too, because we're so driven to just solve problems, and we want to solve it, and we want to be done with it, and we want to have the perfect outcome, like a grand campaign, a render, a photography piece that sometimes doesn't even have people in it because we would just want to leave it perfect, right? Like we're so obsessed with that final output. It is almost us, like designers ourselves, to kind of get out of our comfort zone and feel the discomfort of like never going to be done, and the fact that whatever we're producing needs to be a constant iteration, giving the volatility that we operate in, and also to your point, the outputs being living beings itself, that will hopefully co-create with us. And so this is beyond the practice, it's a cultural like mindset shift. And how do you see, if first in educational space, this needs to reflect into educational systems, how we communicate and educate future designers, but also in organizations that are known to also move and change slowly?
Yeah, so I think that you mentioned something that is very related to this discussion, and I think for me is one of the big shifts when it comes, for instance, to design education, which is one thing that I deal with daily in my profession. You mentioned that design is a problem-solving activity. And in fact, this is one of the things that we have been so much accustomed with. I was trained as a designer myself. I studied in at least three different design schools in Europe. Of course, one was Politecnico, but then I also studied at the Glasgow School of Art, at the art school in Stockholm. So I had the opportunity to really approach design from many different angles and understand how different cultures, at least in Europe, were understanding design. And one common trait was definitely this idea that design is a problem-solving activity. Now, when it comes to the shift that we're talking about here, I think that this is definitely a core part of this shift. And I think that, and it's also what I try to do with my students in my classes here, to let them understand that problem solving, as these technologies will continue to evolve and become even better and better at performing some of our traditional design tasks, problem solving is no longer going to be the central focus of what design is concerned with. And one thing that I'm starting to advocate for is that what is most important nowadays, also to be designers and to be able to grapple with this complex setting in which all the systems and solutions that we deal with are developed, is to understand first and foremost what is the right problem to be tackled rather than how to solve it. And this is a very important cultural shift in design. First of all, because we have to develop completely new, different tools, approaches, and a new mindset. Designers are not very used to setting problems, and they're not knowing for doing it. They are used to receiving a brief, maybe redefining this brief with their clients, but the problem in a certain sense is a given, and it has always been a given. I know that I have to make it very, very banal. I know that I have to design a new smartphone, or I know that I have to design a new laptop or a new public transportation process. That's my focus. Then I can redefine many different ways in which I can achieve this objective, but the problem is a given. While I think that grappling with the complexity that we're dealing with nowadays, one of the most important skills that designers of the future and of the present need to develop is problem setting rather than problem solving. And this is much more important when it comes to, for instance, looking at these new AI-powered tools and software, especially those that are starting to aid the design process, that can in fact develop all the digital interfaces and all the graphics that we were accustomed to developing by ourselves, by themselves, without us, learning from our choices, learning from what we like or do not like, learning from our prompts, but then doing it themselves and doing it quicker, faster, more efficiently, personalizing at a greater scale that we could have never done as humans. And therefore, if we just look at this shift, the question that raises in our mind is, but what is the place of designers then? If they are no longer called to develop a touch point of a service, a nice digital interface, or the nice shape of a product, what is their place then? If the algorithms are going to become much better at doing those. And my intuition, and of course I might be wrong, but from looking around myself and catching some signs of what is already happening, is that what we really need to do is to move upstream the innovation process and becoming problem setter rather than problem solver, because then the algorithms will solve the problems for us. But we still need to have the idea and the intuition about what is the right problem and what is the right way to tackle that problem, which still is and will remain, I think, a very, very human capability.
I love that you talked about, like, setting the problem. There's a famous saying from Russell Ackoff where he says, we solve we spend enormous amount of time finding the right solutions for wrong problems. And this is
Exactly.
quite chronic in the world, regardless of industry and field, right? This might be simply informed by our own assumptions, biases too, like with the result of like a poor research, or again, to your point, people in the process not questioning the things that we need to be questioning just because it's not a muscle that we have exercised enough. And I think it's only natural to think of it in this way as problems are evolving so fast in our day and age too, which then you mentioned good enough for now outcomes is the mindset, but because we need to understand what should we really be addressing today, and given that we are in complex systems and we don't even know what we don't know sometimes, so what is that we can address today, and what does it mean for tomorrow? And it's almost like thinking of design not only because of maybe like AI infused outcomes, but also because of this rapid changing world, that everything we're putting out there is given that it's going to evolve. It is going to call for iteration, and everything can almost like come with a strategic roadmap of how it might evolve, but nothing is set in stone, and there can never be one. This mindset shift really excites me as a practitioner and educator in inclusive design, because in inclusive design, we can never achieve inclusion for all in one go. It automatically calls for iteration and evolution over time. So it really excites me to see like the entire design culture needs to move towards that direction. You positioned this beautifully in an article that talks about fifth order of design. And to give context to our audience too, there's an existing theory around four orders of design by Richard Buchanan, and your research builds upon that. So if you can share a little bit your ideas and approach, like why you felt that was necessary, first of all, and what you mean by fifth order of design, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So really my reasoning started from observing everything that we are discussing now. For instance, the idea that design should shift from being problem solving to becoming a problem setting sort of activity, from looking at all the movements that there was around the idea, for instance, also that we are no longer only designing with humans and for humans, but also including other agents that have agency, for instance, not only algorithms, but also other species that are becoming increasingly relevant in the design process. And this ever-shifting complexity and the fact that the objective of design can no longer be something that is near perfect, but something that is constantly evolving and constantly learning and adapting to solutions, environments, and changes. These are all the reflections that I was making with myself and observing around me, and also listening to many other conversations. And going back to the theory that Richard Buchanan put forth quite more than 20 years ago now, I thought that it was no longer enough for design to only talk about four orders of problems that design is concerned with, but we really needed to start reflecting on what is the next step. And so on the one hand, this journey really started from my interest in data and new technologies. And I think that data is a big part of this, not only linked to artificial intelligence, but also to the use and abuse that we actually do of data nowadays, and the fact that there is a lot of believing that only having data and being able to analyze this data will hold the truth of who we are and what our faith will be. And I felt really an urge to counteract this type of idea, also because designers are much more used to working with qualitative data rather than quantitative data. So on the one hand, I had the question for myself, are we left out of all of this discourse that goes around big data and data analytics and driving innovation and our future building on what these data tell us, or can we say something more, or can we complement this discussion? So this is one part of the story, and data are definitely part of this fifth order, and the way we can, as designers, complement this quantitative numerical logic that big data offer us with something that is a little bit softer, a more human trait to data that in ethnography, and as I also mentioned in my article, are called the thick data. So data that is rich in terms of the story that they say about people, and therefore can really help us understand the deeper motivations behind people behavior, which is one of the evergreen in the drivers of design. And then on the other hand, I was also very much looking at this idea of considering other partners in the design process, and therefore designers moving upstream the innovation processes we were mentioning, and trying to oversee transformations rather than individual solutions to well-framed problems. So we've been talking about complex problems or wicked problems in design for a very long time. But when we look at the profession and how design is really practiced, very often we do not solve those wicked problems, but we solve quite well-defined problems, in fact. And therefore, this movement toward becoming problem setters also is part of realizing, in a certain sense, the faith of designer that, as some other scholars in the literature have described, are best placed to solve these wicked problems. There are studies in behavioral psychology, in semiotics, and several other disciplines that mention also a different cognitive process for designers, to place them as a better profession to tackle these wicked problems. So I think that nowadays, developing this skill and making it a reality is much more needed. And that's also part of my reflection that I linked to this fifth order of design. And therefore, for me, the fifth order is really this idea of becoming problem setters and being able to guide the transformations. Developing pathways towards transformation, and also being able to master the complexity that is behind the system's change, whether it is related to being able to incorporate new technologies meaningfully in our life, not for the sake of technology, not technology for the sake of technology, but because it really brings a value and it really responds to our values, or whether it responds to the climate neutrality challenge that we have. For instance, in Europe, we are very much focusing right now on the so-called twin transition, where twin stands for green and digital. And I do believe that this fifth order is all about tackling this type of transition, and therefore developing complex pathways towards the transformation that we need, or that we are looking for. I mean, at the end of the day, I always remember a very famous quote from Albert Einstein that said, if I had 1 hour to solve a problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes just understanding what is the problem, and only the last 5 minutes to actually solving the problem. So I think that writing this idea of fifth order.
I love so many things, and I want to highlight. And I think what I'm hearing is also the focus on big data plus thick data is almost like the future of how we're working with like artificial intelligence plus human intelligence, right? Like merging those together, and informing any transformation or process through the combination of both. And designers are like moving beyond from like, let's go on this software and 3D model this or whatever that is, but into much more almost curating, conducting a process, and which tools to utilize, who to co-create with, right? And this is not only the technology, but also humans or species you mentioned, like who is the broader design team almost that we need to create with. And when you say transformations, I imagine you're referring to like the change in systems, creating, I guess, the details within a system, um, but also potentially, if we look at like the global transformation, I guess more in like mindset, the mindset shifts, kind of like the pathway to that. We're designing more like roadmaps and pathways going to that. But do you want to describe anything else around transformations, like give any examples of what it might be?
Yeah, for instance, another thing that we didn't mention and that is emerging consistently now in design is also the capability or the need to develop a stronger capability of looking into probable and preferable futures. So this idea of design futures is emerging very strongly, and there are quite a few consultancies that are doing it very well. For instance, one that I love very much is Superflux, which is a UK, London-based design consultancy. And I think that what they do is very much looking into possible transformations because they imagine possible futures and they bring those futures in our present day to help us make better decisions of how we want to get there and where do we want to get. Because at the end of the day, the thing is that nobody knows the future. We make the future daily, and certainly there are no algorithms that can foresee the future for us. There is no real oracle because all the big data, the big data analytics, and any algorithm, no matter what billion data points it has, this is always going to be data about the past. And this is a hard truth. Therefore, the outputs of these very powerful AI systems is very much a sort of mirror that is held against ourselves to see our past. And in some cases, for well-defined and quite stable issues, it is perfectly fine for understanding, in a certain sense, the future, forecasting, they call it in AI. For instance, if we had to use this data from the past to understand how long it is going to take me to go from A to B, that's perfectly fine. That's something pretty stable, and with billion data points, the algorithm can make a pretty accurate prediction on how long this is going to take me. But when it comes to more delicate and more complex issues, for instance, what is going to be the chance that my child is born with a genetic disorder? We can already touch in our daily life that the results of data analytics is not the truth, is not really telling us the future. And there are so many different probabilities and so many different pathways that we can take and so many different possible results that can happen until the day it happens, that posing our faith into these data and technologies is not what is going to make humans and the society better. Therefore, I think that these are practices that we still need to develop. And really the idea in these transformations is to try and imagine what can be these possible futures so that we can make better decisions today, now that we have, to a certain extent, the control over our choices, whether we are a government or an individual citizen living his or her life daily.
Yeah, and you also mentioned like as part of the transformations, and I guess like thinking the future, and let's call, for lack of a better term, reverse engineering from there, the
Or
feedback loop.
broadcasting.
Forecasting, yeah, feedback loops that we could be focusing on designing. And I loved reading about that too, because I feel like we work with many diverse industries, right? And regardless of the industry that we're looking at or the global organization, lack of knowledge sharing or efficient feedback on even the initiatives taken around today's daily issues around sustainability or inclusion, the sheer lack of that feedback loop in the system is getting in the way of innovation, as you know, we don't collect the feedback, or we don't share the knowledge that already exists in this organizational being. And it's quite chronic to observing this over and over in diverse organizations in diverse industries. And as much as we could like mention this to the organizations, and even if they are aware of it, designing that and incorporating that into the system also is a challenge in itself. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, on how, especially with, I guess, both the technology introduction, but the pace it also introduces to our world, in being in our world. Kind of what does that mean in terms of like feedback loops, for feedback loops for the future as well?
Yeah, so this is also a very interesting new notion that is going around the design community. For instance, the idea of feedback loops really comes from, at least in my mind, from trying to understand what is the role that designers can have in devising these, let's say, AI-powered systems. Because, you know, as I mentioned before, if the algorithm can develop all the detailed designs that we were supposed to develop before, then what is the new role for designers? And I think that developing these feedback loops, therefore moving upstream the innovation process or the solution development process, it's really a key, because the new, let's say, responsibilities for designers in that case can really be to decide what are the parameters, for instance, that an AI system should use, and how should this AI system made capable of interpreting reality. Because really, at the end of the day, algorithms follow a very different language and get to know the world in a very different way as compared to humans. And therefore, all our reality and world needs to be translated in a way that a machine can understand, which makes it very, very challenging. So the idea of imagining these feedback loops and becoming capable of entering the logic of the algorithm in meaningful translation of reality, and then creating these key moments in which the designer and still continues to enter the cycle, and making sure that the algorithms is moving in the right direction is one key element. Then it is also linked to how we use data and how we feed the data to these systems. But for sure, there's also a very interesting ramification of this discussion when it comes to organizations and changing the way organizations work, as you were mentioning, in order to respond to the current need for mindset shift, new organizational structures, and therefore breaking those silos and those barriers that we were also mentioning before. And there, I think it is a very important discussion that should definitely happen at a multidisciplinary level, coming from many different perspectives. And one of the key things that I've been seeing there, also working with several public administrations, municipalities, and different organizations in the public space, is that we very much still live design, portray organizations that are very much 18th century based. While we live in 2024, in the 21st century, but our organizations have not very much moved toward this new need for flexibility and knowledge sharing. And we still face, in those respects, so many of the barriers that were there already 20 years ago, or maybe even more, maybe even 50 years ago. And we've never really stopped thinking about how can we seriously overcome these barriers? How can we really work more horizontally? How can we really make organizations more flexible and more adaptive to the shifts that we need? I don't have an answer here, but I think that this is definitely one of the big areas of concern when it comes to the fifth order of design, even if already the fourth order had mentions of designing systems, organizations, and environments, but it's a whole new scale. It's a completely different scale, especially with the connectivity power that we have, and the idea that we can incorporate not only humans in our design processes, but we can co-create with many other different points of view, and therefore that this is one of the new challenges.
100%. I think, we find ourselves almost in a little bit more like education or advocacy space, even when it comes to talking about co-creation culture for only humans with diverse professional and lived experiences, as the current systems or processes and organizations are not really used to that, or are not set up to successfully do that. Or there are also myths around like it will take longer, or it will be more expensive. So we're still like finding us kind of like pushing for that to be possible. And now AI is like pushing us to move towards that culture even like faster. And yet what you said in terms of like organizational setups being still like based on pretty much 18th century, which is not so shocking when you think about like big organizations being advised on change management by other big organizations who are set up the same way. So
Yeah.
we don't really have the kind of like the outliers or out of box players in that kind of maybe change management space, even though in design theory, maybe like you talk about it a little bit. But it's going to be really interesting to observe as with the exponential shift in things in the technology development today, and going through the, I guess, AI renaissance, like whatever it's called, how it's going to push organizations to adapt. And if they don't adapt, what is that going to look like also? I mean, in the past, we have seen big organizations being relevant until they're not, by not adapting to the time. But it seems like we're going to experience that even a little bit faster, maybe, like with what's happening with AI.
Yeah, and I have to tell you that in my current practice, for instance, I'm following a very big project with the European Commission, and we are working with a lot of different municipalities in Europe to support them in the transition towards climate neutrality, which is definitely one of those big transformations that we need. Is one of those huge transitions that we are looking into, and everybody knows that it is relevant and it is needed now or yesterday, but nobody really knows how to get there. And the issues that we encounter in working with these municipalities are always the same. For instance, we advocate for the need to create what we termed a transition team inside the municipality, as a group of people that can help the organization do things differently, engage the population differently, engage their private partners differently, propose new policies that are mission driven and so on. But then at the end of the day, the issues are always the same. Where do we get the money? How do we make this interesting for the citizens? And how do we convince them to use transport differently, not individual cars, but more public transport? But then public transport is not efficient. And then at the end of the day is we don't have the skills internally, we don't have the capabilities. How do we prepare for that? So I think that we still have a long way to go between adapting in the reality in our practices to really make these notions a reality. And we still need to find that best practice that we can really follow and learn from.
I feel like we need to share this episode with legal, finance, public administrators, like people. And like in systems theory, we say like slow change is favorable because we can like build the system, but being stagnant is a different thing. And I think sometimes in the way of like, unless we see like a regulatory shift, we remain stagnant in the way. Maybe we don't see the financial benefits in the next 2 years, so it's hard to adopt, or the capability building is seen as like an entire endeavor to take on, or engaging the public might be seen as a liability. So all of these like mindsets. And we often joke around also, like we talk about these things with our like design students, but sometimes I'm like, I just want to go and like talk to business school students because it's also going to call for very much leadership change. And that was like one of the conversations in during South by Southwest. I overheard talking about, you know, AI is not necessarily the threat, but poor leadership, the lack of change and adaptation in systems is a big threat. And again, this touches very well upon what we were discussing in terms of what is the real issue. What is the actual problem here? It's not AI. And there are challenges around AI that we will address and need to pay more attention and give more of our energy towards, which AI is actually enabling us to free that time and energy to think about those critical things. But also the innovation itself sometimes is not the problem, it's more the where we're trying to operate in the system that we try to exist in gets in the way of that. So we really need to kind of reframe that conversation even and look at what things that haven't changed in like centuries
Yeah,
and
two
see how
centuries.
we 2 centuries and see how we might change that. Marzia, this is like amazing, fascinating for me too, but I do want to be mindful of our time. So I do want to ask quickly for anyone in this space or for future designers or current designers, what would be your advice?
My advice is to remain curious and very critical at the same time. I think having a critical perspective on anything that we are taught, anything that we see deployed, anything that we use nowadays is one of the most important skills for designers. And always keep asking questions when you don't understand. And sometimes this is something that I have to push my students towards very much. And this also become one of the focuses in my classes to really help them develop this critical approach to history, first of all, because we have to know where we are coming from, and then informed by history, a critical perspective on the future, because this is really what is going to help us, or one of the skills that is going to help us in becoming better problem setters. So in identifying better problems that we might want to focus our energies on.
I love it. Critical and curious. This should be like a new brand.
Yeah.
I love it. Marzia, this was such a treat. Thank you so much. It was lovely to meet you, and thanks for making the time for us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I hope that this inspires loads of people, younger and less young, likewise, to becoming more aware and more critical toward anything that they see around themselves. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.